I'm going to demonstrate how to do a crayon resist scarecrow. I'm going to use some watercolor paints to fill in my scarecrow after I draw. But if you do not have watercolor paints at home, you can color your scarecrow with whatever materials you have. And if you have markers, you could even turn them into watercolor paints, which I'll explain towards the end of the video. To get started, you'll need a piece of paper. Your paper could be large or small. I have one scarecrow that I've done on a large piece of paper and one that I've done on a smaller piece of paper. So whatever you have available at home is fine. I'm going to start with the drawing process using a pencil, an eraser, and some tracing tools. You can look around your house and ask permission to use some of the objects in your house to trace things. I have the lids from some plastic containers and a square coaster that I'm going to use. And I made myself a rectangle out of a little piece of paper. You might also want to use a ruler if you need to make any lines a little bit straighter. I'm going to start by making the hat of my scarecrow. I'm going to trace just the top of my larger circle. I'm going to place my smaller circle inside that arc shape and trace the bottom of the circle. Now I'm going to use my ruler to make the bottom of my hat. I made my scarecrow's hat on an angle, but you could certainly make it straight across if you would rather do that. I'm going to make the brim of the hat stick out a little bit and draw the top of the brim across to connect those two lines. Next, I'm going to use my square and trace that for my scarecrow's shirt. And then I'm going to use my rectangle to make his arms and legs. Now, since the rectangle is overlapping the square, I don't need to trace the parts of the rectangle that overlap. I want to make it look like the sleeve just attaches to that square shirt. And you can make the arms in any position you would like. I'm going to use my same rectangle tracer to do his legs. And if you don't have a rectangle tracer at home, you could probably use the edges of a ruler to do those. Now I'm going to draw my scarecrow's face. I'm going to give him a smile. I'm going to use some shapes for his face, his eyes, and his nose. And remember, a scarecrow is not real, so it does not have to look like a real person. I think I'll give my scarecrow a buttoned shirt. And I'm going to make a collar. I'm going to draw an upside down V and then take the bottom points of the V out to the edges of my square. If you'd like to give your scarecrow some details like cuffs on his sleeves or buttons on his sleeves, you can do that. You might also want to make a pocket on your scarecrow's shirt. And I think I'll put some cuffs on the bottom of my scarecrow's pants. Scarecrows usually are stuffed with straw, so I'm going to use a zigzag line to make it look like the straw is sticking out from his arms and out from his legs. And I think I'll add a little straw on the top to give him a little bit of hair. You might also want to make some straws sticking out of his pocket. I'm also going to draw some shapes on his clothes to look like patches. And I'm going to give those patches some little lines to look like the thread that is stitched onto the patch to hold it in place. And you can make as many of those as you'd like. I'm also going to put those same kind of lines on my shapes because a scarecrow is usually made out of fabric, and those shapes would have been sewn onto the head. All right, now once you get done with that, if you're going to use watercolors or your markers like watercolor paints, then you're going to want to take a crayon and outline all of the shapes that you drew in pencil. You could either use one colored crayon like I'm doing, or you can use different color crayons. The choice is yours. You want the crayons to resist the paint. The crayons are made out of a waxy material, and when you paint them with the watery paint, they will resist each other. I have one that I've already finished doing my outlines with. And keep in mind that you might want to also add some designs inside your scarecrow's clothing and maybe make his hat have a pattern as well. When you use your watercolor paints, you can use the brush that came with the set for areas that are tiny. But if you are painting a larger area and you have a different size brush, you might want to substitute one of those, especially if you are working on a large piece of paper. Working with a tiny brush in the big areas will take some time, and a larger brush might be a little easier. I'm going to begin by wetting my paintbrush and wetting the color that I'd like to start with his hat. Let's say I want to give him a brown hat. I'm going to stir my paintbrush in my paint, and I'm going to add that to his hat. Now, the more water you add to watercolors, the thinner or more transparent it will appear. The less water you use, the thicker or more opaque it will appear. Now, since I painted his hat, I want to avoid doing anything else on his face right now. I'm going to move down and I'm going to do a little bit of his shirt. And notice I'm going around the buttons and around the patches. I'll probably want to make them a different color. So I don't want to paint over the top of them if I want them to be something else. And again, since I just finished that top part of his shirt, I want to avoid doing the patterns, the buttons, the cuffs until that dries a little bit. If I did it right away, my colors might run together. I think I'll move down and I'll add some yellow to the straw underneath his arms and underneath his feet or his legs. And if you have room at the bottom of your paper and you want to add shoes to your scarecrow, you can. Usually scarecrows have straw sticking out, but if you have room and you'd like to add shoes, you could do that. And I'll put some yellow up in his hair now because I think my hat is pretty well dried. Okay, I'm going to move on to his pants next. So I think I will make my Scarecrow's pants green. I'm going to leave the patches alone. And I'm going to wait to do the edge of my pants that meets the shirt till the very last, just to make sure that that shirt is dry enough and my colors don't run together. If you ever have a spot that you paint that goes out of the area that you wanted to be that color, you can blot it with a paper towel. So it might be a good idea to keep one of those handy. So you would continue to fill in all of your parts of your Scarecrow. I want to show you what happens when you paint over the crayon patterns a little bit so you can see the resist effect taking place a little bit more. If I take a little bit of my red and I go over the top, you can see that it's only filling in where the white spaces are. It's pulling away from the black crayon. Now let's say you don't have any watercolor paints at home, but you have markers. Your markers can be used just as easily. I have one that I started with markers and I'll show you my trick. So if you take a piece of aluminum foil and your markers, you can create your own watercolors. So let's say I want to finish his blue shirt. I'm going to color some blue marker on my aluminum foil, and I'm going to take my wet paintbrush and stir it into my watercolors or into my marker, and it changes it into a wet liquid marker, kind of like a watercolor paint. Now that won't work if you're using permanent markers. Those are not water soluble, so they will not dissolve in water. Okay? Next, let's say I want to make his pants red, so I'm going to add some red on my aluminum foil. And I'm going to wet that, change it into a liquid marker, and add that to the bottom. You can draw with your markers on your paper and then go over them with water as well, but sometimes it's a little harder to control how dark they get. And again, try to leave places right next to what you just painted alone until they dry a little bit better. I think I'll take some brown marker and do his hat. And you can always add a little bit more water to the paint that you've created right on the paper if you need to make it a little thinner. All right. Again, if you don't have watercolor paints or you don't have markers to make your own watercolor paints, you can certainly color your Scarecrow in with crayons or colored pencils or oil pastels or whatever material you might have at home. I hope you enjoyed that. I can't wait to see what you make.